My own brother laughed when he found out I was still renting at 45. He leaned back in his chair at the family barbecue and said, "You spent your whole life paying someone else's mortgage." And everyone around the table chuckled like it was the most obvious truth in the world. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just nodded and took another sip of my iced tea. What he didn't know was that for the past 3 years, rent checks from one of his own buildings had been landing in an account with my name on it, but I let him believe what he wanted. I had been doing that for a long time. I have lived in rented places for over 2 decades, small apartments, basement units, sometimes a one-bedroom that smelled faintly like old carpet and cleaning supplies, places where the walls were thin enough to hear someone else's television through the night, places where you learn quickly how to stretch a dollar. I worked double shifts, sometimes at a diner, sometimes cleaning houses in neighborhoods where the homes were bigger than anything I had ever lived in. I would scrub marble countertops and polish hardwood floors while listening to homeowners talk about refinancing, property taxes, appreciation, words that sounded distant back then, like a language I wasn't supposed to understand. Every month I wrote a rent check, sometimes late by a day or two, sometimes right on time if I had picked up enough extra hours, and every time I handed it over, I could feel that quiet judgment, the look landlords give when they think they have you figured out. Just another tenant, just another person passing through, not building anything, not going anywhere. I learned early not to react to those looks. I learned to keep my head down, to listen more than I spoke. Family gatherings were the hardest, birthdays, holidays, summer cookouts like that one. Conversations always drifted to houses, mortgages, equity. Someone would mention how much their home had gone up in value. Someone else would talk about remodeling a kitchen. And then eventually someone would glance at me and ask, "You still renting?" Like it was a temporary condition I had somehow failed to outgrow, like I had missed a step everyone else managed to take. I would smile, say yes, and let the conversation move on. Because explaining would have required more than they were willing to hear. What they never saw were the notebooks I kept, the small ones I carried in my bag, filled with addresses, rental prices, notes about neighborhoods, which streets stayed quiet, which ones turned over tenants every 6 months. I learned patterns. I learned how landlords thought, how tenants behaved, what made a property profitable and what made it a burden. I wasn't wasting money. I was paying tuition in a way no one recognized. Every rent check was a lesson, every apartment another piece of the system revealing itself slowly, quietly. By the time I turned 40, I was still renting, still working long hours, still living in a place most people would have outgrown. At least that's how it looked from the outside. But inside something had shifted. I understood things I didn't before. I saw opportunities where others saw risk. I stopped asking when I would finally own a home and started asking a different question entirely. What if owning wasn't about where I lived, but about what I controlled? And that was the question that changed everything, even if no one else noticed. Even if they kept laughing, even if they kept believing I had failed. The truth is, I did not start with any grand plan. I did not wake up one day and decide I would build anything impressive. I was just trying to survive the next month, then the next year. After my divorce at 27, I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment with my son. It was barely 600 square feet. The kitchen light flickered if you turned it on too fast, and the heater made a rattling sound every winter night. But it was what I could afford, and at that time that was enough. I worked mornings at a diner off the highway, pouring coffee for truck drivers and regulars who always sat in the same booths, and in the afternoons I cleaned houses, sometimes 3 in a row. Sometimes more if someone canceled and another client needed last-minute help. I remember carrying my supplies up long driveways in neighborhoods where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine, wide lawns, 2-car garages, front doors taller than anything I had ever walked through. I would let myself in quietly, do my job, and leave without anyone really noticing I had been there. But I noticed everything. I noticed which homes stayed empty longer between tenants. I noticed which owners complained about maintenance costs, which ones talked about raising rent, which ones seemed relaxed because their properties were already paid off. I listened when they spoke on the phone, not because I was trying to intrude, but because those conversations taught me more than any book could. I started to understand patterns, not just numbers, but behavior, what made people hold on to property and what made them let go of it. At night, after my son was asleep, I would sit at the small kitchen table with a notebook, writing things down, addresses, rent prices, little details about neighborhoods, whether a place felt stable or temporary. I did not know exactly what I would do with that information yet. I just knew it mattered. It felt like I was slowly learning the rules to a game no one had ever explained to me before. Money was always tight. There were weeks when I had to choose between fixing my car or buying groceries for the full week. There were nights I ate something small so my son could have a proper dinner. But even then, I never stopped setting aside something, $10, $20 when I could, small amounts that did not look like much at the time, but I treated them differently, not as savings for emergencies, but as something I was not allowed to touch, something meant for a future I could not yet describe out loud. People saw the outside of my life and thought they understood it completely. A woman working too much, still renting, still struggling, and in a way they were not wrong. I was tired most days. I worried about bills. I felt the pressure of time the same as anyone else. But what they could not see was that I had stopped measuring progress the way they did. I was not counting how fast I could buy a house. I was counting how much I was learning, how much I was noticing, how much closer I was getting to understanding how everything actually worked, and that quiet shift, the one no one else noticed, was the beginning of something they would not believe even if I told them then. The first real shift did not feel like a breakthrough. It felt small, almost forgettable. It happened in a house I had been cleaning for over a year, a quiet duplex on a corner lot, nothing flashy, nothing impressive, but steady. The kind of place where tenants stayed longer than usual. The owner was an older man who lived out of state. He rarely visited, and when he did, he always seemed tired, like the property had become more of a responsibility than an investment. One afternoon he showed up while I was finishing the kitchen. He stood there longer than usual, looking around like he was trying to decide something. Then he said he was thinking about selling, not because he wanted to, but because he was done dealing with repairs, late payments, and everything that came with it. I remember that moment clearly, not because of what he said, but because of what I felt. It was the first time I saw an opening instead of a limitation. I did not speak right away. I did not say I was interested. I just asked questions, simple ones. How much he wanted for it, what kind of issues the property had, how long the tenants had been there. He answered without hesitation. Maybe because he did not see me as someone who could do anything with that information. To him, I was still just the person cleaning his floors, and that was exactly why I listened more carefully. That night I sat at my kitchen table longer than usual, running numbers in a way I had never done before. I calculated rent, expenses, small repairs. I looked at my savings, which still felt small compared to the price he mentioned. But for the first time it did not feel impossible. It felt like a gap I could close, not overnight, but over time. I realized something important in that moment. Owning property was not always about having enough money. Sometimes it was about recognizing when someone else wanted out. I did not tell anyone about that conversation. Not my family, not my coworkers, not even my closest friend. I kept going to work the same way, showing up at the diner, cleaning the same houses, writing the same rent checks for my own apartment. Nothing on the outside changed, but inside, everything had started to move in a different direction. I began asking more direct questions when I worked. I paid closer attention to how leases were structured, how deposits were handled, how small problems turned into larger ones if ignored. I was no longer just observing, I was preparing. Months passed, and the owner of that duplex called me again, this time more serious. He said he wanted to sell quickly, that he did not want to list it and deal with agents. He wanted something simple. That was the moment most people would have hesitated, would have said they were not ready, but I had already spent years getting ready without realizing it. I knew I did not have enough to do it alone, but I also knew I did not need to. I reached out quietly, not to family, but to someone I had met through work, another property owner who had once mentioned looking for small deals. I did not present myself as an expert, I just presented the opportunity, calmly, clearly, without pressure, and for the first time, someone listened to me not as a cleaner, not as a renter, but as someone who understood something valuable. We structured something simple, something that did not look impressive on paper, but changed everything for me. I put in what I had, he covered the rest, and in return I would manage the property, handle tenants, oversee maintenance. Things I had already been learning for years without being paid for it. When the agreement was signed, nothing about my daily life looked different. I still went home to my rented apartment, still woke up early for work, still kept my head down at family gatherings, but somewhere in the background, quietly, without announcement, I had stepped into a different role, one that no one around me could see yet, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Managing that duplex did not feel like ownership at first. It felt like responsibility layered on top of everything I was already carrying. I still woke up before sunrise to get to the diner, still worked through long shifts with tired feet and a forced smile, still cleaned houses in the afternoon. But now, in between all of that, I was answering tenant messages, scheduling repairs, tracking rent payments, learning how quickly small problems could grow if ignored, and how important it was to stay calm when something went wrong. The first time a tenant called me late at night about a leaking pipe, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone for a few seconds longer than I should have, not because I did not know what to do, but because I realized there was no one else to pass the responsibility to. This was mine now, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone acknowledging it. I had stepped into a role that demanded more than I had ever been asked to give before, and I accepted it the same way I had accepted everything else in my life, without complaint, without hesitation. I learned quickly that managing property was not about control, it was about consistency, showing up, following through, making decisions even when you were unsure. I kept detailed notes the same way I always had, every repair cost, every late payment, every conversation. Patterns started to emerge again, just like they had when I was cleaning houses, only now, the patterns belonged to me, not someone else, and that changed the way I saw everything. Months turned into a year, and then another. The property stabilized, tenants stayed longer, issues became predictable instead of chaotic. The numbers started to make sense in a way they never had before, not as abstract ideas, but as something real. Something I could track and influence. The first time I saw money come in after expenses, small as it was, I did not celebrate. I just wrote it down, added it to my records, and moved on, because I understood something important by then. Consistency mattered more than moments. From the outside, nothing about my life looked different. I was still renting the same apartment, still driving the same old car, still showing up to family gatherings where conversations sounded exactly the same. People talking about promotions, vacations, home upgrades, and occasionally glancing at me with that quiet assumption that I had stayed in the same place. I never corrected them, never hinted at anything else, because by then I had learned that explaining your path to people who are not walking it rarely changes anything, it only creates more noise. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I saved more, reinvested what little profit came in, and waited, not passively, but with intention. I began looking at other small properties the same way I had once looked at that duplex, not with urgency, but with patience, understanding that the right opportunity does not always appear when you want it to, but when you are ready to recognize it. There were setbacks, repairs that cost more than expected, tenants who left suddenly, months where the numbers tightened again. But none of it felt like failure, because by then I understood the difference between struggling and moving forward. One keeps you stuck, the other teaches you how to adjust, and I was adjusting, quietly, steadily, in a way no one around me could see. And that was still exactly how I wanted it, because the less they noticed, the more freedom I had to keep building something that did not need their approval to exist. The second opportunity did not arrive with excitement. It arrived quietly, almost hidden inside a conversation most people would have ignored. I was cleaning a small townhouse owned by a couple who had recently decided to move out of state. They were tired. Not just physically but mentally, the kind of exhaustion that comes from juggling too many responsibilities for too long. They talked openly in front of me, not because they trusted me, but because they did not see me as someone who would act on anything they said. To them, I was still just part of the background, someone who showed up, worked, and left without leaving a trace. They mentioned selling the property, not because it was failing, but because they wanted simplicity. They no longer wanted to deal with tenants, repairs, and the constant attention a property requires. I listened the same way I always had, quietly, without interruption, but this time the difference was clear. I knew what questions mattered. I knew what details to pay attention to, and more importantly, I knew what I could do with that information. That night, I did not feel overwhelmed the way I had years ago. I felt steady. I opened my notebook, reviewed my numbers from the duplex, calculated what I could realistically contribute, and thought about structure. Not ownership in the traditional sense, but partnership, leverage, timing, things I had slowly learned through observation and experience rather than formal training. I reached out again to the same contact I had worked with before, but this time the conversation was different. I was not just presenting an opportunity. I was explaining a plan, calmly, clearly, with details that showed I understood both the risks and the potential. There was no urgency in my voice, no need to convince, just clarity, and that made all the difference. Because people do not respond to desperation, they respond to confidence that does not need to be announced. The agreement came together faster than I expected, not because it was easy, but because I was prepared. I had already spent years building a foundation no one could see, and now it was simply a matter of placing the next piece. I took on a larger role this time, more responsibility, more involvement in decisions, more exposure to how everything connected, and once again, nothing about my external life changed in a way anyone would notice. I still rented the same apartment, still worked long hours, still kept my routine simple and predictable. At family gatherings, the conversations continued exactly as before. Someone would talk about refinancing, someone else about property taxes increasing, and occasionally someone would glance at me and make a comment about renting, about stability, about how important it was to own something by a certain age. I would listen, nod, and let the moment pass, because by then I understood something they did not. Ownership was not a milestone you reached once. It was a system you learned to navigate, and I was no longer outside of it. The difference now was not just what I owned or managed, it was how I saw time. I was no longer in a rush to prove anything, no longer measuring myself against timelines that were not mine. I was building something slowly, deliberately, and the more I built, the more I realized how little of it needed to be visible, because the real progress was happening in places no one thought to look, in decisions made quietly, in patterns recognized early, in opportunities taken without announcement, and that quiet momentum, the kind that does not draw attention, was becoming stronger with each step I took, even if, from the outside, it still looked like nothing had changed at all. By the time the third opportunity appeared, I did not feel excitement anymore. I felt recognition. It came through a tenant from the duplex who mentioned their landlord was struggling to keep up with payments on a small 4-unit building across town. Nothing about the situation sounded dramatic, no crisis, no urgency, just quiet pressure building over time, the kind of situation I had learned to notice long before it became visible to everyone else. I asked a few questions, not too many, just enough to understand the outline, and then I let it sit in my mind for a few days. The same way I always did, I had learned that rushing decisions often came from emotion, and emotion had no place in something that required clarity. I reviewed my numbers again, everything I had built so far, the duplex, the townhouse, the small but steady income streams that had started to form a pattern. It was still not enough to do something like this alone, but that was no longer how I thought about growth. I thought in layers, in connections, in ways to structure something that made sense for everyone involved. I reached out carefully, not widely, just to the same circle I had quietly built over time, people who understood the kind of deals I was looking for, people who valued stability over quick returns. The conversation was direct, no exaggeration, no promises beyond what I could support with numbers, and that made it easier for them to listen. We visited the property together, walked through each unit, noted what needed attention, what was working, what could be improved without overextending. I stayed quiet most of the time, observing, calculating. Connecting what I saw with what I had already experienced, I did not need to impress anyone. I only needed to understand what was real, and that had become my advantage over time, seeing clearly without the noise of expectation. The agreement took shape slowly, more complex than anything I had done before, but still grounded in the same principle: shared responsibility, shared benefit. I took on management again, but with more authority this time, more involvement in decisions that affected the long-term value of the property. When everything was signed, I did not celebrate. I simply updated my records, adjusted my schedule, and continued moving forward, because by then I understood that milestones were not moments to pause, they were points to continue from. From the outside, nothing changed. I still rented the same apartment, still drove the same car, still worked my regular hours. My routine remained simple, predictable, almost invisible, and that invisibility had become something I protected. Not because I was hiding, but because I did not need attention to validate what I was building. I had seen enough to know that attention often comes before stability, and I was more interested in stability. At the next family gathering, the conversation returned to the same place it always did: houses, loans, upgrades. Someone mentioned rising interest rates. Someone else talked about selling and moving to a better neighborhood. Then someone looked at me and asked, almost casually, if I had ever thought about buying a place of my own. I smiled the same way I always did and said I was doing fine, and that was enough for them, because they heard what they expected to hear, not what was actually true. What they could not see was that my life had already expanded beyond what they were measuring. I was no longer thinking about one home or one milestone. I was thinking in systems, in patterns that repeated across properties, in ways to build something that could grow without depending on a single outcome. And that shift, the one that changed everything, remained completely invisible to them, because I had never given them a reason to look closer, and that was still exactly how I wanted it to be. The pace of everything began to change, not suddenly, not in a way anyone around me could point to, but in a way I could feel in the decisions I was making. I was no longer reacting to opportunities. I was anticipating them, noticing patterns before they fully formed, understanding which properties would become available before the owners even admitted it to themselves, and that awareness created something new, not just stability, but momentum. The 4-unit building started to settle into a rhythm. Tenants paid more consistently once small issues were addressed quickly. Maintenance costs became predictable instead of overwhelming, and for the first time I began to see how scale worked. Not as something dramatic, but as something quiet and cumulative, each unit adding a layer of stability, each decision compounding over time, and that changed how I approached everything that came next. I began to structure my days differently, still working the same jobs on the surface, still showing up to the diner and cleaning houses, but now every action had a second purpose. Every conversation was a chance to learn something new. Every property I stepped into became a case study. I listened more closely when owners talked about why they were selling. I paid attention to what they were tired of, what they wanted to avoid, what they valued most, because those details mattered more than any listing price. What I built was not visible in a way people could easily measure. There were no announcements, no sudden changes in lifestyle, no new car in the driveway or bigger apartment to show progress. I kept everything the same, intentionally, because I had learned that growth does not need to be displayed to be real. It only needs to be consistent. The next step came from an unexpected place: a conversation with a contractor who had been working on repairs at one of the properties. He mentioned a small building that had been sitting half-vacant for months. The owner was struggling to keep up with it. Not because it was a bad property, but because it required more attention than they could give. I listened the same way I always had, quietly, without revealing interest, just gathering information, asking a few questions, letting the details settle before deciding what they meant. By then, I understood something clearly. Opportunities rarely arrive in perfect condition. They come with complications, with unfinished work, with uncertainty that discourages most people from stepping in. But that uncertainty had become familiar to me. It no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like part of the process, something to evaluate, not avoid. I did not rush into it. I reviewed everything carefully, compared it to what I already had, considered how it would fit into the system I was building, not just as a single deal, but as another layer in something larger, and when I moved forward. It was with the same approach I had used before, steady, structured, without unnecessary risk, without drawing attention. At family gatherings, nothing had changed on the surface, the same conversations, the same assumptions, the same quiet judgments that had followed me for years. Someone mentioned rising rents. Another talked about how difficult it was becoming to keep up with mortgage payments, and then there was the usual glance in my direction, the unspoken conclusion that I was still in the same place I had always been, still renting, still behind, still trying to catch up. I let them believe that, because correcting them would have required me to explain something they were not prepared to understand, and I had no interest in doing that anymore. What mattered was not what they thought, but what was actually happening, quietly, steadily, without interruption. I was no longer just managing properties. I was building something that could continue without constant effort, something that could grow beyond the limits of a single job or a single paycheck, and that realization, the one that shifted everything, stayed with me in the same way all the others had, quietly, without announcement, because the less visible it was, the more it could continue to grow without interference. The next shift did not come from finding another property, it came from realizing how everything I had built was starting to connect. The duplex, the townhouse, the 4-unit building, and now the small vacant property the contractor had mentioned, they were no longer separate pieces. They were part of something that could support itself. Something that did not depend entirely on how many hours I worked in a day, and that realization changed the way I approached everything moving forward. I moved carefully with the new property, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of each decision now. I walked through the building more than once, not just looking at what needed to be fixed, but imagining how it would function once it was stable, how tenants would move through the space, how maintenance would be handled, how costs could be controlled without cutting corners. I had learned that success in this was not about making something look impressive. It was about making something work consistently, quietly, over time. The deal itself was structured the same way I had learned to structure everything, balanced, intentional. Nothing rushed, nothing exaggerated. I contributed what I could, leveraged what I had built, and once again stepped into a larger role. One that required more oversight, more coordination, more trust in the systems I had been developing piece by piece for years. And when it was done, when everything was signed and in motion, I did not feel the need to tell anyone, not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer felt like something that needed to be announced. My days continued to look the same to anyone watching from the outside. I still worked at the diner, still cleaned houses, still lived in the same rented apartment, the same walls, the same small kitchen, the same routine that had defined my life for so long. And that consistency became something I relied on, not as a limitation, but as a foundation, because it allowed everything else to grow without disruption, without unnecessary attention. At the same time, the numbers behind the scenes were changing, slowly but steadily. Income from different properties began to layer together, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that created stability. Expenses became easier to predict, decisions became easier to make, and for the first time, I could see a version of my life that did not depend on the next shift, the next paycheck, the next immediate need. It was not sudden, it was not overwhelming, it was quiet, the kind of change you only notice when you look back and realize how far you have come. The moment that brought everything into focus happened at another family gathering. Nothing special, just a weekend afternoon. The same people, the same conversations, my brother talking about a property he had recently invested in, explaining the challenges he was facing with tenants and maintenance, the same frustrations I had heard from so many others over the years. He spoke with confidence at first, but there was a strain underneath it, the kind that comes from managing something that feels heavier than expected. Then he laughed and said something about how complicated it all was, how owning property was not as easy as people thought. And someone at the table joked that at least I did not have to deal with any of that since I was still renting. I smiled the same way I always did, calm, quiet, without correction, but this time something was different. Not in what I said, but in what I understood. I was no longer on the outside of that conversation. I was no longer someone looking in. I had been living inside that reality for years now, handling the same challenges, making the same decisions, learning the same lessons, just without the need to talk about it. And as I sat there listening, I realized something even more important. The gap between what they believed about my life and what was actually true had grown wider than ever, and I had allowed it to stay that way, not out of fear, but out of choice. Because the less they saw, the more space I had to keep building without interruption, without expectation, without pressure, and that space had become one of the most valuable things I had gained along the way, something I was not willing to give up, not even now. The moment everything could have been revealed came without warning. It was not planned, not staged, just another conversation that slowly shifted into something deeper than anyone expected. My brother had been talking for a while about one of his properties, the same one he had been so confident about months earlier. Now the tone was different, more careful, more frustrated. He mentioned rising costs, unexpected repairs, tenants who were not as reliable as he had hoped, and for the first time I heard something I had learned to recognize clearly: uncertainty behind confidence, the kind that appears when reality does not match expectations. Someone asked him what he was going to do, and he shrugged, said he might sell if things did not improve, that it was becoming more trouble than it was worth. The room shifted slightly, the way it does when people start to realize something is not going as planned. And then, almost casually, he turned to me and said, "You are lucky you never got into any of this. Renting might not be so bad after all." A few people nodded, someone laughed, and just like that, the assumption they had carried for years settled comfortably back into place. I could have said something then, I could have explained, corrected, changed the way they saw me in that moment, but I did not. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood something they did not. Validation given too early often changes the way people listen. It turns understanding into comparison, curiosity into judgment, and I had spent too many years building quietly to trade that for a moment of recognition that would not last. Instead, I asked him a simple question. What exactly was causing the most pressure? He explained. Maintenance costs, inconsistent tenants, the feeling that everything required constant attention. I listened carefully, not as someone outside the situation, but as someone who had been living inside that reality for years, just without announcing it. And as he spoke, I realized something else. The gap between where he was and where I had been was not as large as it seemed. The difference was not experience. It was perspective, how you approached the problems, how you structured the response, how you managed what could be controlled and accepted what could not. I offered a few suggestions, nothing that sounded impressive, just practical adjustments, small changes in how he handled certain issues, ways to reduce unnecessary costs, approaches to stabilize tenant turnover. He listened more closely than he had ever listened to me before, not because he suddenly saw me differently, but because the situation required him to consider anything that might help, and for the first time, I could see the shift, not in how he saw me completely, but in how he heard me. The conversation moved on eventually, as it always did, back to safer topics, back to the familiar patterns that define these gatherings, but something had changed, quietly, subtly, in a way that did not need to be acknowledged out loud. I had stepped into the conversation not as the person they thought I was, but as the person I had become, and that was enough. Later that evening, as I drove back to my apartment, the same apartment I had lived in for years, I sat in the parking lot for a moment before going inside, thinking about everything that had happened, not just that day, but over the years that led to it. The long hours, the quiet observations, the decisions made without recognition, the patience it took to let things unfold without forcing them, and I realized something clearly. I had never been behind. Not once. I had simply been building in a way that did not need to be seen to be real, and that understanding, the one that settled in without noise, without announcement, was worth more than any moment of proving anyone wrong, because it meant I no longer needed them to see it at all.